This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On the 30th of January, we held our first Security Studies luncheon of the spring 2013 season. And the RCMI's own Executive Director, Col Chris Corrigan, spoke to us on how to build a military, a primer in force structuring.
Chris Corrigan. Thanks, George, for those very kind words. And I'll let you over here so you can kind of see the slides. Thank you for coming. This is our first Security Studies luncheon of 2013. We're always struggling with over-programming in the Institute with military history nights and special events. We had the Army Commander in last week. My former, he was one of my company commanders. He's a three-star commander of the Army. Peter Devlin, great guy. And so I'm pleased that we have sufficient center of mass to be able to conduct today's Security Studies luncheon. I was reminded by a squadron commander of mine in my early days. I had this very small ferret scout car troop, and it was very small. I had like only 16 guys, and sometimes they weren't available for training. And I was reminded by my squadron commander at the time, he said, "Pritchler, provided you have one soldier to train, that's sufficient to conduct the training." So thank you for, we've got 13, 14, maybe 15 people here, so thank you for showing up. This is a pretty dense subject. I ran it through my wife and my younger daughter last night, and I'm going to try and keep this to about 30 minutes. Please, don't be shy, go up, get some more dessert, eat some more throughout. It won't faze me whatsoever. I'll just keep on talking. I'm going to use some notes for your own protection, I guess, and so that I don't wax too long and eloquently. But it appears to be a simple subject, but if we look at this, these are kind of the questions we might talk to. What do we want our military to do? And these are age-old questions that if it was 200 years ago, 100 years ago, 2013, these are the questions that are always bandied around. What have we told the military to do? Those are the ways. What do we want them to do? In what ways? What capabilities do we have? What capabilities do we need to primarily, is first, pull it up the top here, what we want the military to do, the ends, and having defined the ends, the ways, and the means, what gaps are there, and how do we fill the gaps? So it looks simple, but I can tell you in my experience at the college, where I was the Director of Strategic Studies, schooling colonels and Navy captains to become newly minted flag officers and general officers. We'd spend 10 months virtually talking around these kind of issues and how it fits into the machinery of government as we know it and how it exists now. So it's even a daunting challenge to try and cover this in 40 minutes. What we're going to talk about is this thing here called the Force Development Framework. And I'll let you follow this. It's not a linear dynamic, although it appears to be for this graphic. All these things all mesh together throughout, and it looks neat and tidy, but it's not. It's very messy. And it starts with the foreign and defense policy, the strategic guidance, and it comes through designing concepts and taking a look at capabilities and how we plan for those capabilities, concepts and lessons learned in the past, experimentation, doctrine and training. And then once that part's done, we get into the real messy business of engaging with government and competing with other government departments for the monies required for the military program, what we call the Defense Service Program. And those then get translated in the investment plan, and go into the forces, the standing forces, the joint, the Army now, the Royal Canadian Navy, the RCAF, and the corporate Department of National Defense that supports the uniformed Canadian Armed Forces, two distinct differences, and how that then gets refined into capability, employment, and operational commands. So we see what it is, we want what it is, the thinking part, and this is precisely, I'm going to talk about this today. The rest of this is so messy, and it includes politics and decisions and regional economic expansion, economic trade-offs, etc., etc. That could be the subject of another presentation, should you demand it of me, and perhaps we can make that can be part two. And but I need to talk to you about this right now, and I'll remind you, we've gone through a bit of a structural change in the Canadian Forces, and this pretty much reflects what we had about 10 years ago before we got deeply involved in Afghanistan. 10 years ago, the Deputy Chief of Defense Staff was the Chief Operator of the Canadian Armed Forces. And he had domestic operations and expeditionary operations and special forces. Afghanistan came along, and we then went through a restructuring, created some commands. We created Canada Command, we created Expeditionary Command, we created Special Forces Command, and a Canadian Support Command, all of which to varying degrees were commanded by 1 or 2 or 3-star officers that had to have their attendant staffs with them. But we did not increase the number of staff officers, nor increase the throughput of professional development training for these officers. Well, things have changed in the last year. We recognize we're coming out of Afghanistan. There's no longer the need for these commands, and we've essentially gone back to 10 years ago. We have 1 3-star now, and he's commanding the Canadian Joint Operations Command. That's the Lieutenant General Stu Beer. And under his purview is Canada for domestic operations and expeditionary operations. And we've left in place Canadian Special Forces Command. Now, inside each of these is we've devolved from the then Canadian Support Command, the support and sustainment capability. We've put them back into each of these organizations in Joint Operations Command. Not the least of which we now call the Royal Canadian Navy and the Royal Canadian Air Force that you see up here, that was essentially as it was, and now is as ours being. So that's just a little update on the Canadian Forces organization. I've been intrigued with this topic for many, many years, and any such discussion must take into consideration government policy direction, our geopolitical reality that has resulted in a military history that has been primarily in expeditionary operations. I'm on one of my trips to Kiev. I've been with the same group of colonels and their joint staff, and I was reminded over lunch we were having borscht for everything in Ukraine. And they said, but Chris, we're trying to think about expeditionary ops. We've always been focused on territorial defense. And as you know, the geopolitical, where the Ukraine is situated, certainly from the Second World War, the gateway through and down through to the Caucasus and Azerbaijan and the oil fields there, they've always been focused on territorial defense, and even more so now because the Soviets or the Russians are in their northern border, and but they're trying to think about expeditionary operations, and they commit to, and they have committed to Iraq and to Afghanistan, very small company-sized groups. the point they made with me was, Chris, your army, your military has always been expeditionary. And so that was, well, I just took it for granted that everybody else did like we did, go everywhere, have one person holding that Canadian flag. That was sufficient for Canada to be there. So we've been primarily expeditionary. And these operations reflect the nature of conflict, the changing nature of conflict. They reflect our culture and our military history, which has always been expeditionary. It has been said that interests are things we value, and values are things that we're interested in. I'm going to talk a little bit about this. At the outset of any policy considerations, and certainly any options to deploy our military, interests and values have to be clearly defined by answering such questions as, what interests or values are being served? Is the option values-based? What values? And answers to these basic questions provide a gut check for our government and for Canadians and as to whether or not we should accept an option and deploy. Interest, as Hans Morgenthau wrote in Elements of Power, I think it was University of Chicago professor, he defined interests in a hierarchy of three. And the interests are those elements which contribute the state's compelling needs, such as self-preservation, independence, national integrity, military security, economic well-being. And they are classified as vital, major, or peripherals. Vital interests are those situations, events, or trends which are deemed to threaten the survival or security of a nation, and which the nation is prepared to counter by resorting to strong measures, including military action. Major interests are situations which, although threatening the basic security interests of the nation, can be diminished or eliminated through compromise such as diplomacy. Peripheral, the third in the hierarchy, the lowest, includes situations which do not affect the nation's defense or national security or the integrity of and stability of the international system. So Louis Saint Laurent, as Minister of External Affairs, speaking at the inaugural Gray Lecture at the University of Toronto in January of 1947, defined the basis of Canadian foreign policy for the next generation, and in it he placed national unity first among the principles that must underline this policy. So not surprisingly, every Prime Minister since then and in the future has and will place national unity as a vital national interest. Now, quite timely this past week, this editorial cartoon appeared in my favorite newspaper. I call it my favorite. I used to deliver 81 copies of the Hamilton Spectator and Stony Creek. You didn't put that in the intro there.
No.
But this, and I'm falling out of love with it because the editorial slant is, you read the newspapers that tend to support your political leanings, but we call it the Starlight in Hamilton. Okay? But this is, if you can read this at the top, I thought it was quite timely, prophetic. This talks to the interests of ordinary Canadians right now. I'm talking about the interests of the Government of Canada at a higher level strategically in Ottawa, what the political elites are thinking about. But your average Canadian right now, this is, so what do we got here? We got this big sort of circumplex here, a big radar scope. We've got the operator here, and he's got his cup of coffee, and he's got his red phone way over here. And from the center on, the degree of importance that your average Canadian places to these things. So we've got right in, whoops, here we go. We've got right in the middle here, of course, the weather, which occupies Canadians all the time. Justin Bieber. I'm told that one of my, somebody young told me that Justin Bieber has eclipsed in his Twitter's somebody else, you know, a huge one. He's the most twitted person there is right now. So
it just shows he's a twit.
Plus, yeah, and I am told by a reservist friend of mine, he was really shocked when the Prime Minister gave Justin Bieber his Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal, himself personally. The Honourable Stephen Harper gave it to him, and he was dressed in a T-shirt and blue jeans, you'll see. Not the Prime Minister, but Justin Bieber. And then we have further out here, little concerns. We got Justin Trudeau. Is he truly the second coming? Rhetorical. Okay, we're not allowed to talk about politics in here, are we? No. And then we see out here, of course, we're the hostage taker, really, Canadian, in the Algerian thing. We're still waiting for Foreign Affairs to determine if they had Canadian passports or whether real ones or whether or not they were fake. But look at this. You know, last week, the inauguration, Beyonce apparently it was reported that she lip-synced. So these are the things that really occupy Canadians right now. And of course, for all the, for you women, that's not a military target, that's Target. It's coming the month after next to all the former Zeller stores. So this is occupying the Canadians. But best of all, this shows what Canadians think about what's going on right now in the outside world. We've got Mali there, okay? So I leave that for your consideration. We've spoken to interests. We've got vital, major, and peripheral. I'm sorry, those are interests. Talk about values. And values for us, we put a certain emphasis as Canadians and on values. And sometimes we get interests in values mixed up. As I said at the beginning, values are things we're interested in and interests we value. Okay? The national values are those timeless, universal, non-controversial notions that virtually every community cherishes. And in Canada includes such things as respect for democracy, the rule of law, human rights and the environment. Elizabeth May, didn't she? She was given her seat, wasn't she? Nobody ran against her out west. Anyway, you know, environment. So it's a good thing. And they're further defined as Canadian values to be defended: colon, democracy and the rule of law, semicolon, individual rights and freedoms as articulated by the Charter. I don't want to digress too much. I was with a British officer years ago, and he said to the group of folk I was with that the greatest threat to Canadian security was our Charter of Rights and Freedoms of 1982. Whether or not he's right or wrong, who knows? And that's the individual versus the collective. I throw that out there. Peace, order, and good government, as defined by the Constitution, and sustainable economic well-being, of course, and that relates back to Target, and whether or not they're going to charge more money in the Target store, more for things at Canadian Targets versus the one in Lackawanna near Buffalo. Jeff Collins wrote an article in our next about to be distributed issue of Citra, and he's a PhD student at Carleton, and he writes of post-heroic warfare, whereby Western societies view sacrifice on the battlefield in non-existential wars or wars of choice as unwarranted. He posits that societies are more inclined to engage in conflict should the potential for low casualties and low economic costs be ensured. That makes sense. We're talking a little bit about Mali, and you saw that radar. Syria, Tunisia, Morocco, it's all in that sphere of influence, to use the old Soviet term, the near abroad for Europe. And it's an ideal mission for the European Union. But the European Union isn't really getting on that pony. It's only the French right now. And especially under what the European Union advertises the European Union Security and Defense Program, the ESDP. You may recall last year we had Colonel Roger Van Damme come in this room and talk to the French forces and the European Defense and Security Program. But so far, few of the EU nations have ponied up, to use that term. And despite the fact that the European Union postures, they say, They have a capability to commit 30,000 troops in rapid order to any operation. So much for the European Union. Let's focus in a little bit closer to Canada, and we'll start with we'll examine some history and things that are still perhaps relevant to today. There is a cyclical dynamic that occurs post-conflict, when savings through a reduction in security and defense spending can be applied to other programs. We've seen this after the Second World War, when Prime Minister King's policy to return to the pre-1944 structure. During the end of the Cold War, in 1989, 1991, the peace dividend cuts of the Conservatives and the Chrétien, Martin, soft power policy espoused by Lloyd Axworthy. Axworthy hijacked Joseph Nye's concept of soft power, ignoring that soft power has to be backed up by hard power. In Canada's case, it wasn't. This soft Canadian power came in the form of setting the intellectual example to the world, and in so doing appeal to and influence lesser states to behave properly. How sanctimonious were we? And this was the so-called dark age for the dark decade for the Canadian Armed Forces. I might add, it was the dark decade for foreign affairs and for D&D, for the departmental side of the defense establishment. And I saw this same parallel in the United States. I would take my War College course to Washington once a year, 3 years in a row. We'd be feted in the Pentagon. We'd go there, and they had everything. They had everything they wanted. In a similar way, during the Afghanistan experience, our military pretty much got fed everything that they asked for good reason. We were at war. But in the State Department, when we went in there, they were the poor cousins. They didn't have flat screen TVs. They had old offices, the carpets were threadbare, and they suffered a lack of profile in the United States. In a similar way, foreign affairs during the 1990s has withered on a vine. And you see across the world, you see ambassadorial staff will consist of the ambassador, a charge d'affaires, and everybody else in the embassy will be locally engaged employees. And our military attaches are out there, and they're covering, there might be a Bonn, but they're covering 3 or 4 other countries. A buddy of mine, he's spoken in this room and spoken on a world site. Chris Kilford is the military attache in Ankara. And he does Turkey, he does Azerbaijan, he does Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and pick some more stands. But he's never, with his traveling budget, he's never going to cover them all within his 3 years that he's there. So one would think that as you retract and come back in and get smaller, that you want to keep your tentacles and all your links out there to gather information and practice diplomacy in a smart way. But it's not always the case. The budget war in the 90s, we saw a reduction in the size of the armed forces. I lived it personally. We had to fight the budget war. My regiment, when I handed over command, and part of 4 Canadian Mechanized Brigade Group, was meant to disappear as it was heading west back to Canada. But much of the 4th Canadian Brigade ended up spending almost a decade east in the Balkans at that time. So we never ever truly lost or gained the numbers that we thought we would get. Capabilities, once you lose them, it's very difficult to get them back. It's not just about equipping. An example, a really good example, is our submarine service. We almost lost that capability. For to be very honest with ourselves, we still have not brought the capability up in our submarine service to be operational. And we've been watching that and sort of agonizing over this, small 4-boat fleet of submarines. And it hasn't yet gotten to that. I only say that because it takes 10 years to train an NCO, a sergeant, to operate a weapons system. And if you get rid of the weapons system and you get rid of the system, it's going to take you about 10 years to get it back up again if you need it.
10 years
10 years for a sergeant.
to learn a weapons system.
Yeah, to be a sergeant crew commander of a Leopard 2 3A tank. To be a crew commander. And I only bring that up because some nations have decided to get rid of the capability. New Zealand has gotten rid of its air defense fighter capability. They have no air defense fighter capability whatsoever. They've mothballed it because they thought it was too expensive. So once you lose the capability, hard to get back. We then had the Somali inquiry, which had a dramatic impact upon the armed forces, and the moral component, the human dimension, and all of that. You may remember around that time there were, how best to describe them, sophist elites that at that time in the 90s were proposing that we should reduce the armed forces to a constabulary. We had no need for them in the future. We'll just do a constabulary force and we'll keep it like that. But then we think about Rwanda, we think about Iraq, we think about Afghanistan, we think about Kosovo, and we resurrect capabilities that we almost got rid of. And I say this all up to throw out that you can't be a whim. You can't chase the whim or the flavor of the week in terms of organization and structures. It has to be pretty current. You have to keep a baseline level of capabilities. So these are all examples of how unpredictable, how unstable the world is, and why a balance of capabilities is needed in order for the military to succeed in any missions that the government of Canada will give to it. 12 years ago, who would have thought we were in Afghanistan? The first troops we deployed there were in green, you know, they're good for temperate climate in the woods. So we had no idea we were going to be there. Maurice Pope, writing in 1937, put it this way: the first step in the approach to a solution seems reasonably obvious. We must first ensure that the measures adopted for the organization of our defenses are in harmony with our national requirements and our means, unquote. Doug Bland, who speaks in this room frequently, he's identified a number of enduring ideas on defense that are held by Canadians and their governments, not just that radar scope that we saw, the screen there, but they are enduring. Although Canada's defense is ultimately Canada's responsibility, quote, no direct threat exists or has ever existed to Canadian territory, such that there is an obvious need to maintain large standing forces to meet it, unquote. I'll read it again. No direct threat exists or has existed to Canadian territory, such that there is an obvious need to maintain large standing forces to meet it. Now, you might take umbrage with that. You could say the Japanese had balloons that flew over and hit the west coast in World War II. There were German U-boats in the Gulf of the St. Lawrence. But there is a bit of truth to what he's saying here. At the 1940 meeting in Augsburg, New York, Prime Minister Mackenzie King and President Roosevelt signed the agreement that bears the location's name. The gist of the Augsburg Agreement is that the defense of Canada is so vital to American interests that any threat or attack on Canada would undoubtedly bring an American response. In its national interest, Canada should maintain sufficient defense capabilities that Canada cannot become a safe haven for others intent on threatening the United States. Since the Augsburg Agreement in 1947, Canada has pursued a policy of multilateralism through the NATO and the United Nations as a counterbalance to the overpowering influence of the United States on Canadian affairs. I didn't touch upon the Diefenbaker, the Beaumark missile crisis, and the interaction between the United States at that time, but that's a good example. So throughout much of our history, in the absence of a direct threat, and that the United States would come to our aid in order to protect the United States with the attendant loss of our sovereignty, Canadian governments have treated defense as discretionary. I would suggest that this may no longer be the case, as we've got homegrown terrorists such as the Toronto 17, albeit it was in June 2006, 6 years ago, some of which are serving time now, and new Canadian immigrants using Canada as a base to fund terrorist groups such as the Tamil Tigers. And we see, most recently, the Algerian Prime Minister, Abdel Malik Zalal, claiming that 2 Canadian nationals were among the band of al-Qaeda-linked militants who took hundreds of workers hostage at the natural gas complex in Algeria. Referring back to vital, major, and peripheral interests, we could say that in the past we have not had a vital interest threatened, and that our military structure and contributions to international operations driven by major and peripheral interests were discretionary. However, if we accept that our relationship with the United States is of vital interest, the size, structure, and capability of our military, and all departments and agencies engaged in domestic and North Atlantic security must be sufficient to not permit the United States to be threatened by our lack of due diligence. And I submit the vital interest relationship with the United States is not discretionary. We haven't talked about trade and economy and economics, that relationship, but it is, everything we do defense-wise is discretionary because of no threat, but that's shifting over now because of the importance of our relationship with the United States.
But haven't we had someone in NORAD since 1950? A Canadian officer or officer?
Oh, yes, yes.
So the Canadian participation in the defense of North America, particularly from the air,
Yes.
the long-standing relationship is still going on.
You know, at this moment in time, we've got 1 CF-18 in Bagotville, Quebec, 1 CF-18 in Cold Lake, on 20 minutes notice to fly to protect the North American airspace over Canada.
Thank God.
7,000 kilometers wide. It's another 8,000 kilometers deep. So
Yeah, but we'll get there, Pat.
Yeah. We overtrain them, and they, you know. So your cases there. You've got staff officers,
Yeah.
and all these great organizations, and we provide pound for pound excellent staff officers and in command appointments. But it's what's behind it. You don't have the mass to
No matter.
to totally make the Americans feel comfortable. Okay, let's get on with this. So when we talk a little bit about this, I'll let you read that slide. This is essentially what it's about. How much is enough? What do you want? How do you do it? And this is how we do it, through force planning.
Who wrote it?
Oh, this is standard definition. This is
Did you write
a
that?
departmental definition.
That's departmental.
Yeah.
They obviously haven't read it.
So a more efficient, cost-effective procurement system and simplify the logistics management. But I'll talk to what you're inferring in a moment there, Adam. So to be realistic in the force planning, it requires these things: thorough and detailed analysis and evaluation of the security environment, threat perceptions and practical assessments of the available defense resources, what we got, linked to a capacity, and be it anything from domestic defense production, industrial capacities or infrastructure, manpower, and seek to ensure that limited financial resources that the country can devote to this challenge are dedicated to effective and sustainable forces. So all these, the planning starts with some guidance from government. And as you will recall, that slide I said wasn't a linear process, the Canadian Defense Planning Framework. It starts with the guidance and works through what it is, thinking what you want to do, and what you have, and how it gets translated through means and ways and means, and finally resourcing. We see this in a particular strategy where the security challenges are taken a look at. There's a vision and roles. We take a look at core missions, the capabilities required, the gaps, as I mentioned at the beginning, and that then gets translated into defense investments. Now, the defense investments, I can't talk about. That's a political decision. It's one of those things that is slave to the political process, and it's something any departmental planners or Canadian Forces planners have no control over. All they can do is give best advice to the government, and the government will make that decision. And that guidance that we've had for a few years now is the Canada First Defence Strategy. I'll talk about this a little bit later. In that front part where it says security challenges, we have this changing environment. Call it the new norm. The environment is always changing. Call it the revolution in military affairs, or is it the evolution of military affairs, which was the great academic buzzword of 10, 15 years ago. There's no revolution in military affairs. It's evolving. And government imperatives thrown in this big soup here. Changing international environment. You can see this slide of the wall falling in Berlin. Budgets, of course. Transformation. Fiscal priorities. More diverse operations and higher tempo. Okay, that's a reality. And this is an interesting one. Rapid technological change and leap ahead technologies. We're not going to, this presentation doesn't deal with that back end stuff. Okay, the resources and financing and technological stuff, time doesn't permit it. But let me leave this with you. The rapid technological change is happening so quickly that by the time we procure and get a weapon system or a piece of equipment in the hands of the trigger pullers, the system itself may in fact be not quite obsolete, but isn't up there and isn't the state of the art. So leap ahead technologies means whatever you procure in the future, talk about the F-35, it's designed, it's got enough built-in future to it that it will cater for the next evolution of such things as software, targeting, and all the other neat things you need for the next generation. That's apart from the 10 years it requires to train a pilot to fly one of these $70, $80 million planes now? Yeah, okay. So that takes time as well. So you got to build that in. That's never ever really talked to when you read about it in a paper. You don't want to buy something that's already behind the technology. Okay. There's institutional inertia as well in the Air Force. If this room is full of fighter pilots, they would die on the floor over the issue of planes always have to have pilots. Okay, that may no longer be the need with the sophisticated technology and drones and everything else. Okay.
Well, they have pilots, except they're in the back.
Yeah. But you know, there's the softest part inside the most fragile part in a fighter plane is the humanoid that's in it flying it. The rest of the plane is pretty robust. It can pull all these G's, but they have to design the plane so that the pilot doesn't black out. And so maybe we don't need piloted planes in the future. Who knows? Anyway, that's an institutional inertia that you get pushed back from. You see it in the Army as well. But I won't talk to you about my own personal experiences with it. So this all gets translated to such things as our 6 core missions that we see in the Canada First Defence strategy. I would submit to you that in various shapes or form, since Confederation, we had these missions. Okay, we had domestic missions, And you can see, conduct daily domestic and continental operations, including the Arctic and through NORAD. Support major international events such as the 2010 Olympics. Respond to major terrorist attack. Support civilian authorities during a crisis in Canada, such as a natural disaster, in this case the ice storm you see depicted there. And then on international operations, leading or conducting international operations for an extended period, or deploying forces in response to crisis elsewhere in the world for shorter periods, such as the C-17 in Mali. Okay. So those are our 6 core missions. However, the mission doesn't define the force structure, because you come back to the questions about the balance between forces for each of those missions and the kinds of expeditionary forces you're going to have. The approach to procurement by looking at roles and missions isn't often too successful. We always get back to the political choices. There's no escaping the fact that even if we have a very good understanding of the roles and missions of the Canadian Forces now and in the future, we're still going to need to have political discussions. Political decisions about who gets what from the national treasury, about how much of that goes into the armed forces, about how many and what kinds of structures you're going to have in the armed forces, and about what kinds of missions you're going to get involved in detail. The reality for politicians is that they're always dealing with a great deal of uncertainty in the details of the missions. If anything characterizes Canadian Forces, defense policy, or Canadian defense policy over the last 25 or 30 years, it's surprise. The government is always surprised at the state of the armed forces. And the armed forces is always surprised at the missions that government gives them. As I mentioned earlier, it's hard to find anybody who in 2001 would have said that the Canadian Forces would have mainly deployed in Afghanistan. So it's very difficult to draw a strategy around that. Surprise and uncertainty make it a very difficult program. So as a result of these assigned missions, specific capability requirements become evident. And these are the capabilities that the Canadian military has codified. They are in various shapes and forms. The U.S. military has different ones, but they all relate pretty much to these capabilities. NATO has its own capability list as well. Of course, we need personnel. We need R&D. We need operational research. We need concepts. We need doctrine and collective training. Information technology infrastructure. Supply and services. So, we're talking about capabilities and capability planning here. And there are 3 types of force planning. And here they are. Legacy, threat, and capability-based planning. And by best example, we can see the legacy-based planning is what we found and still find in the post-Soviet states of Eastern Europe, of which I have some familiarity with. And it's simply about maintaining the force structure that you have, for reasons perhaps other than territorial defense that I alluded to before. My sponsor, the guy I worked through in the Ukrainian Defense Academy, Viktor Vukoyevich, they're all named Victor and their last names are always Vukoyevichi or something, Timoshenko. He shared with me, he said, you know, we were never ever going, we didn't build all these tanks we just needed to keep everybody employed. We didn't build them to fight you guys. And we realized it was employment for everybody in the country, but we thought they were going to actually attack us. So they had legacy-based, and they're still thinking that way now. They're stuck in that line of thinking. And then there's threat-based, and we were part of that during the NATO Cold War. It was we had existential threats in Northern Europe. So we were structured, we were resourced, we had the capacity and the capability to fight that Cold War. But then the world kind of shifted after the 1990s. Asymmetrical warfare, nonlinear warfare. We had non-combatants, we had terrorists, and homegrown terrorists coming in. And then we realized that rather than having a threat-based environment or a threat-based planning process, take a look at the capabilities that we truly need. I kind of spoke to this threat-based planning. Resource levels tend to be stable. Geographic areas are clear. And here's the advantage of capability-based planning. And it's an alternative to threat-based planning. And it's so necessary for expeditionary operations, such as we conduct in the Maine and in Canada. It's what you need to do, not what you have. It reflects the present-day realities of asymmetrical, unconventional warfare. And for the past 10 years, we've been involved in unconventional warfare, COIN, counterinsurgency. We may have an army that's very well schooled now and experienced in conducting counterinsurgency warfare, but it's going to take them a while to get reset, recocked, and loaded to conduct mid-level conventional warfare operations. Because that's all they know. The lifespan of a soldier is 10, 15 years at that, and then they get out. So the experience base we've gained in Afghanistan is already dwindling. And it talks about capabilities. Here's a good example. Involved in the tank procurement program myself, it was always about how best do we use our tanks, or we replace the tanks. He said, no, we have to flip this around. What is it? What capability do we need from a particular platform? Not just replacing that old tank with a new one. It can be replaced, the tank capability can be replaced by some other system perhaps. Generic steps in that, policy guidance, I spoke to it. Now this too looks like it's iterative. It isn't. We've got our policy guidance in our Canada First Defense strategy. We then take a look at scenarios. And scenarios are related to what's most likely, what's least likely, what's most dangerous, what's least dangerous. We could spend, we could have a workshop here this afternoon and flip up some flip charts, and each table could spend a couple of minutes and say, okay, what are the likely scenarios Canada faces for which they need the arms that are not on that slide? And what does this slide say? We've got peace. This is a spectrum of conflict here. We're in peace. We've got some conflict, mid-level, and then we're actually in war at this side. So these are the scenarios that we have for which we need capabilities for as they migrate through the spectrum of conflict. So operations other than war. Search and rescue, this has always been, and we've been very, very poor at resourcing that. I've spent some time in Yellowknife and Whitehorse, and our search and rescue capability in the high north is not very, very good, to say the least. Okay, again, we've got a search and rescue center in Halifax and a search and rescue operational center in Comox, and you know how many millions of square kilometers there are up north. And the difficulty in finding airplanes. Disaster relief, all of these are pretty self-evident here. Okay, so we need to have a balance to meet these capabilities. When I went to the Ukraine, I thought this was a pretty easy process of doing a strategic defense review. I had a couple of PhD academics with me who were schooled in the process of capability-based planning. which is our way of doing it through scenarios, and then coming up with the capability gaps. We spent 4 trips trying to educate them on how you develop scenarios, which they came up, which they pretty much look like this. Then we took a look at the threat-based force that they had, the number of tanks and everything else for territorial defense. And then we looked at what they needed for the capability. And then it came to a grinding halt because he had no way of costing it. And if we were to go to this portion in here, this is where the costing part comes in our process. We call it activity-based costing. For the longest part of my career, we were not budget managers. You didn't have to worry about a budget. You just trained, you did according to the training plan, and later on in the second half of my career, we were all turned into little budget managers. And so we had to account for every bit of ammunition, every gallon of fuel, track mileage, and everything like that. And so we've had in place now for 15, 20 years a very good costing mechanism for how much it costs to do what. The Ukrainian sense, they never, ever, ever had to cost it. In the good old Soviet days, the military got everything it wanted, and because if it didn't, it would just overthrow the government. And it was pretty simple. And now, they're like every other developing nation, they have to argue with ministries for other ministries of a bigger cut of the budget pie. So we couldn't do that with them. I spent some time trying to teach them about activity-based costing, and you've got a year, cost out everything you do, and then at least you have an algorithm, a baseline to carry out your training, and then you can then take these numbers to the Minister of Finance and say, you want us to do this? Well, here's what it's going to cost you. And then it's turned over to politicians to make that decision. I'm going to wrap this up so there's a couple of minutes for questions. And it always boils down to this: how much is enough? How much is enough is whatever the government tells us is enough. And that balance between what your average Canadian thinks their interests are right now, be it Beyonce or Target, and what we in the defense and security community really see as our balance of interests and values, and what we think is important, and how we go through this next round of, from an institutional point of view, arguing and defending with other government ministries that are now, that have felt, and it's worth recognizing this, that have felt that the Canadian Forces and the Department of National Defense, they were the lead dogs for the last 12 years because of Afghanistan. We were fighting a war. And there's a lot of deputy ministers in each of these departments right now that are pulling out their sabers. And the Department of National Defense and the Canadian Forces is going to feel the repercussions of the let's get back at the department and let's get a larger slice of the funding for our own programs. So I'll quit for now. I think, to paraphrase Churchill, the military is like a house. If you remodel it too often, it no longer resembles the original structure. To return it to what it once was takes time, patience, sensitivity, lots and lots of money. So let's hope that the future force structure decisions serve the community needs of security needs of Canada without putting its citizens at risk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. I think what we should do is have some questions. If anyone is desperate to leave, they can sneak out now, but because I have a feeling we're going to have at least 3 formal questions, and there may be half a dozen of us who would like to stay and debate things a little bit longer. Why not? We've got the guy here, and obviously he's got a very broad, deep background and knowledge. So, questions? Any questions we've got? Yes?
Yes, please, Julie.
Chris, where do the reservists fit into all of this? You didn't mention them at all, but you did mention the potential loss of knowledge as people move out of the armed forces. And I remember General Hillier saying at the time that what he wanted to do was to make it a lot easier for people to move from active to reserve and back to active, so that the expertise that was gained during active training wasn't lost. And we also saw, both in the Balkans and in Afghanistan, how the reservists filled huge gaps in the CF, and that would fit in. And one of the things that struck me, I went on a tour of NORAD installations a few years ago, and the commanding officers and top brass of all of those NORAD installations are reservists, called up to active duty, but they were all reservists, and for various reasons. But there is a link. I think one of the things, again, that you sort of hinted at, but when you talked about what are Canadians interested in, is that there was absolutely no connection between civil society and the military until Afghanistan. When the bodies started coming home, that sort of made people think about it. But the reserve force is one of the ways in which that connection can be maintained, because it's absolutely essential to support any kind of decision on military spending, etc. Because if an MP thinks that his total constituency is against military spending because they want it all spent on health and so on, then obviously he's not going to vote for that kind of thing. And that's what we saw happening during the so-called Decade of Darkness. So I'm just wondering if you want to comment a little bit on where reservists might fit in and how we need to think of them.
Your points are very valid, very considered. It's a natural dynamic of what we've been through, and it's always been that way in Canada, the role of the citizen soldier. We didn't have a regular force. Everybody was permanent. It was the Canadian militia permanent force before World War II. And it was only after World War II where we developed a professional force, if we can call it. My talk today is at a pretty strategic level, at the departmental level of how we go about a planning process. So we could drill down to the impact of reserves throughout. Of course, we know that's that in that capability, the top one of personnel, the human capital as it's known. That's part of it. The use of the reserves. You know, these are very big political decisions that are made. I know that Prime Minister Harper did deliver to the Minister of National Defense a letter saying, in any future force manning levels, do not reduce the structure of the reserves. However, it boils down to funding. And I know it intimately from the Argyles, this infantry, and
well, we heard it from Devlin, actually.
Yes,
he said reduction in people is not going to happen.
Yeah.
Training budgets are going to be cut by 22%.
Yeah.
There's a huge difference there.
And that it does kind of make sense, you know, if you put on your, you know, I'm a contrarian, you put on your cap and say, well, we're not in Afghanistan anymore. We're not fighting anymore. We weren't taking what we had, any mission up until Afghanistan. When I took close to 2,000 Canadians to Bosnia, 10% were reserves. But it was by virtue of Afghanistan that we then upped that number to 20, 22, 23% were reservists. And honestly, we created a permanent class of Class C contracted reservists that loved to soldier, liked the money, and liked the adventure of it. So, yes, it was, the regular force relied upon the reservists, but it also fed the reservists' mandate to improve the awareness in the communities, but also fed their need to do some good active soldiering. So it's, I don't know whether or not that answers it, but essentially it comes down to how much money the political decisions will be spent on. We know, I know the Toronto Garrison well, having been the area commander. The internal politics of having the local riding MP, also the Minister of National Defense, phoning me on a Friday afternoon saying, can I drop by the headquarters and get a briefing on what's going on in Ontario? And I'd say, Minister, yes, when would you like to come? I'm in the elevator, I'll be up on the 3rd floor in about 20 more seconds. So I always was doing that, understanding that
Well, it just
relationship.
seems to me that it's, especially when you're grappling with budgets and what to do about it, that it's a really cost-effective way of looking forward. Because there's an enormous investment in training these people.
Yes.
And in training the regular forces. If you somehow hang on to them, I mean, that's how Switzerland operates. They're basically a reservist army, the whole thing. But yet they're known as among the top people in the world. So I think it's really a matter of cost effectiveness as well as staying connected to the community and having something there for emergencies. Because who would have foreseen Afghanistan in 2000? And the need for it.
And Switzerland, I know, you know it's neutral, and it's all about territorial defense, and they don't go outside the boundaries of Switzerland. So.
Any other questions? Yes.
Would you discuss separating the non-combat part of the Army from the combat? I don't see why the Army is involved in search and rescue.
Yes.
I
There
think,
is a-
that's
thank
a
you.
very good question. This whole
Yeah.
business of how do you move from the full military down to the militia, down to kind of the world youth or whatever, so you have a flow of structure.
Regarding the Olympics.
Yeah, and these are, there is a school of thought that search and rescue, we can contract it out. On the northern slope of Alaska, it's contracted out to a First Nations that just happened to be there, and they've got their helicopters, and
Toronto Harbor.
and they do it. So we could very easily do that. However, the Air Force really likes to keep that search and rescue capability. Okay, so this is an internal institutional thing that's there. So yeah, we could contract it out. Ted Lennox, who works out of Yellowknife. He's a former member of RCMI. I spent an hour with him in his office, and we have, like, up there in Yellowknife, one Twin Otter and a couple of helicopters, and the discussion went about how do we have any visibility of how many airframes there are in the high north? Do you know, like, there's 1,700 helicopters flying around in the north as we speak now? There's another 2,000 civilian fixed-wing Bush pilots flying around in the north. It would seem to make sense to me that rather than that guy sitting in the control room with the big radar screen there, have visibility of where all of these civilian airframes are, so that they could be like what the U.S. have is called the Civil Air Patrol Service, where they could all be seconded at a moment's notice or whatever and get paid to go out and do search and rescue. Because they know the environment, and they know it, and they're there. They're living in it. So.
Is there active discussion going on at the top level?
No. It's all about still deciding for 15 years now what type of airframe we're going to have for search and rescue. And it's funding again. It's money.
Just, I was wondering, you were talking about vital interests and also switching to capabilities planning. What role do you see the military playing in the Arctic? Because I see that as the biggest vital interest national security issue of the 21st century for us. So what role do you think the military should play in that, given the capabilities planning document?
Well, the Prime Minister has said he's a big focus on the Arctic. I was up in Nook a couple of years ago, and this was the first big. We had the classic, and if you find an old SITREP about 3 years ago, 2 years ago, 2 summers ago, 3 summers ago, on the front cover is the picture taken by a combat photographer of Harper and McKay standing on the HMCS Toronto, I think it is, and in the background is a submarine and flying above is a aurora. It was a classic shot. It wasn't photocopied or anything like that, or photoshopped. That it was staged perfectly. So there's this wonderful photograph. Like in all these things, it's the answer is how much is it going to be resourced? You can put out a policy, but if it's not backed up with the capability of the resourcing. But it's up there. We're resurrecting the Canadian Northern Warfare Training Center. We had it there in Yellowknife, in Churchill, Manitoba, for years and years. Having lived in a tent at 125 below zero in January of 1973, we did that sort of stuff, but we lost it. It was because we didn't think there was ever going to be a threat. So the threat now, you could argue that we've got 5 diamond mines up there now. There's the resource implications. Yes, the Russians put a flag on the North Pole under the ice cap, but really, the biggest enemy up north is the weather and survival. So, in short, if it may be, you may be absolutely right, Carl, that it is the focus for the north, but down here where most of us live 100 kilometers from the American border.
On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying thank you for listening to us today. Watch for announcements of future event transcripts, and we hope that you will be able to join us in person for our regular speakers events. Once again, thank you for tuning into our podcasts, and have a wonderful day. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying thank you for listening to us today. Watch for announcements of future event transcripts, and we hope that you will be able to join us in person for our regular speakers events. Once again, thank you for tuning into our podcasts, and have a wonderful day.